And it really became a compelling interest. These people felt so unwanted and unloved and feared. The more I got to know them, the more I realized what wonderful people they were.
People came from hundreds of miles away to a small village in southern India to visit a surgeon and an ophthalmologist. These two English doctors changed a region forever by offering not only healing for the body, but also for the heart and soul. Paul and Margaret met while both were attending medical school in London, England in 1937. They were at the top of their class that first year. Margaret finished first and Paul second. It was clear that successful medical careers awaited them.
We often didn't know at all what lay ahead of us, but we both had a very strong faith that the Lord who'd led us into that would take us through adventure by adventure.
Both Paul and Margaret had experienced life in foreign lands. Margaret spent her youth in South Africa, while Paul grew up in India.
You know, both of them, when they got married, understood that the only way they could get married was that they both wanted to be medical missionaries. And that was part of the arrangement, and that was part of the understanding when they started dating.
Paul proposed to Margaret in 1942 on the agreement that whoever was called first to mission work in another country, the other would follow. Margaret secretly hoped to go back to Africa, but Paul went first to the land of his childhood. In 1946, Paul was asked to join the Christian Medical College in Vellore, India, as one of two general surgeons on staff. He decided to go survey the situation before sending for Margaret and their two young children. Margaret was unsure if she should go. Many family and friends were opposed to it.
I had now 2 hours to make up my mind. And the Lord gave me a vision. I saw this shining figure in front of me. Whether I had my eyes open or closed made no difference. It was there. And one hand was upraised, pointing east. I could see it, the sunrise was there. And I just answered, I said, Lord, in my heart, I said, Lord, if you want me to go to India, I am willing to go, but only if you take away this fear from me. I was really scared. And the figure began to fade. And in its place came the most wonderful sense. Talk about the peace that passes understanding. I have a whole new concept. It was a palpable peace. It was as if I'd come in on a cold day and somebody wrapped a warm blanket around me. And without any further hesitation, I just said, I didn't pray out loud, I just said, I'm going.
I think it's fair to say that I went to India with the feeling that there was a lot of suffering there. And I was going to India in the name of Jesus Christ to help relieve human suffering, where there were no doctors and very little pain medication. But when I went there, one of the early things that I experienced was to see beggars along the side of the street and outside the temples, people with no fingers on their hands, blind, with feet that were either grossly ulcerated and covered with flies or amputated. And I asked people, what are those? What are those people? Oh, they said they've got leprosy. Leprosy? I'd never thought about leprosy. But why they got all those awful deformities? Oh, that's what leprosy does.
When I first arrived, I had no inkling, and nor did Paul, that we were going to get 100% into leprosy work. We had no idea of leprosy. We were, like many other people, a little bit scared of it.
Somehow, having gone to India to teach medicine and surgery at the Christian Medical College, I suddenly had the feeling, this is why I've come here.
Leprosy is an ancient disease with a social stigma that was often religion-based. Even today, ingrained in many Christian, Hindu, or Muslim cultures is the belief that someone suffering with leprosy is cursed by God. Because people believed there was an evil spirit in them, lepers were removed from their families and not allowed to marry. They were sentenced to live apart and die alone. Leprosy, now called Hansen's disease to lessen the social stigma, destroys the nerves. The bacillus attacks the cooler areas of the body, the hands, feet, face, and most devastatingly, the eyes. Because patients cannot feel pain in their limbs, they often injure them, causing severe ulcers, which eventually lead to amputation. Dr. Robert Cochran, who hired Paul to teach at the local medical college, had begun a project to establish the first leprosy clinic in the area. At that time, no leprosy patients were admitted to the hospital in Vellore, and an alternative site was found in Karagri, 8 miles away. It opened in 1953.
Nobody wanted leprosy on their back door. And the government only gave us this plot of land because nobody could do anything with it. Nobody was going to come and live here.
Dr. Ernest Fritchie, who took over as director of the clinic during the time Paul and Margaret began working there, was an ecologist far beyond his times. He began planting trees and soon transformed the rocky, desert-like plot of land that nobody wanted into a tropical oasis. This was a striking metaphor of what they hoped to accomplish in their leprosy patients.
Patients were coming from various places because they were not being taken care of in other centers. They were not being taken care of by most hospitals. And then they realized that there's one hospital here where the doctors were very kind and good. So they would be happy to travel long distances just to get that personal care which was available here.
At that time, deformities and the loss of limbs were believed to be the work of the leprosy bacteria. But when Paul autopsied leprosy patients, he discovered that the nerves, especially those closest to the skin surface, were destroyed.
She's not feeling the cotton.
So this suggested to him two things. One was that actually all this ulceration, deformity and eating away of the limbs may not be the work of the bacillus, but may be the consequence of the destruction of the sensory nerves and the loss of sensation. Now this was a totally new way of looking at it.
Dr. Brand discovered that foot ulcers and the loss of fingers and toes were not caused by the leprosy bacteria, but by constant trauma and subsequent infections. Injuries that caused the rest of us to recoil in pain hardly fazed those with this disease. He showed that if you prevented limbs from getting injured and gave ulcers time to heal, the damaging effects of leprosy would end.
So when we go to some things he's famous for, such as finding that leprosy patients' fingers don't fall off and that they don't have bad flesh and that's why they don't heal well, but rather it's because they can't feel pain. You think somebody would have noticed that in 2,000 years, but nobody had until Paul Brand looked at it and said, why does that happen? He went to all the world literature and the world expert to try to find out what they said, and he wasn't happy. He said, no, that doesn't make sense.
Paul now knew that the problem with leprosy patients was that they lost their ability to feel pain and literally destroyed themselves. He advised health workers to teach their patients how to live safely without pain's natural alarm system.
But when I had begun operating on leprosy patients, I realized they couldn't get jobs because of the stigma of leprosy. So they had good hands, but nothing to use them on because they couldn't get work. So I said, well, they've got to have rehabilitation. We've got to have a program to teach them to use their hands. We'll turn them into carpenters and plumbers. And I built a rehabilitation center. And suddenly found myself sitting on a high stool supervising 20 young men learning to use insensitive hands, and I had to adapt the saws and hammers and pliers.
When Paul arrived, he did more than just diagnose and treat leprosy patients. He discovered revolutionary ways to make a leper's useless hands and feet work again. His loving attention to all the details of each person's life helped solve vocational, relational, and spiritual problems, and thereby rehabilitating the whole person, not just treating the disease. Ulcers were a big problem, especially on the feet. So Paul built a small shoe factory where special shoes were made to help foot ulcers heal. This proved far more beneficial in preventing deformities than teaching scores of orthopedic surgeons to correct them.
So if the foot is damaged, having ulcer or bony prominence, or patient not having well padding under the sole,
Yes.
so we give a molded in sole.
Okay, this is molded to the foot using plaster of Paris,
cast.
and then this is the mold that is made.
We put it inside the shoe.
There's the insole.
Yes.
Okay.
Before medical school, Paul spent 5 years as a carpenter. He later understood how his experience building houses also helped him learn to rebuild human limbs.
Later, as he was working with his leprosy patients and trying to refashion their hands and make tools that they could use to keep from hurting themselves, he realized how every one of these stages in his life were preparing him for what he became. And that is a person who was trying to really remake human beings. If he had been just a surgeon and not an engineer, not a carpenter, he wouldn't have been able to do all these other things.
So God knew ahead of time that I was going to need the skills of simple mechanical engineering. And he wanted to get that out of the way before putting me through medicine, because he knew that once I'd done medicine, I would be off and running.
By restoring the use of their limbs, Paul allowed a person to earn a living, return to their community, and slowly lose the leprosy stigma and restore their dignity. Another major breakthrough that Paul perfected, which would save many patients' limbs, was far less scientific. He noticed that sometimes a patient would go to bed with an entire finger and wake up with part of it missing.
What we found was that somehow rats got to know which patients could feel pain and couldn't feel pain. Anybody who can feel will kind of immediately move and the rat will run away. But if the hand doesn't move, then they'll take a bite. And if it still doesn't move, then they have a meal. And by morning, the tip of their finger will have gone.
And therefore, again in his practical way, he said the simplest problem is not so much rat traps and so on, but we will encourage each patient to have a cat.
We had a breeding program for cats, and we sent a cat with every patient when they went home. And the cat would sleep beside the patient and serve as their pain protection for the night.
His legacy, I would say, that no problem is insoluble if you commit yourself to it.
Meanwhile, Margaret asked if she could help in the clinic, as long as it wasn't in the eye department.
Then came a little note from the director saying, "We don't want to hurry you, Margaret, but we must have more help in the eye department." And I just turned the note over and wrote on the back, "I'm sorry, Carol, I know nothing about eyes. You'll have to look for someone else. I don't mind being hurried, but that's the status." Within an hour, back comes another note, and it just said, "You'll learn. Please start on Monday."
Margaret, who had experience in pediatrics, finally relented and went to the eye clinic to pitch in.
And it was terrifying. We had about 400 patients to see that first day, and I didn't even know how to examine them.
When they were finished, Margaret came across a boy with unusual symptoms. He was ignored because he had leprosy.
And I looked at them and I thought, I have never seen anything like this in my short experience in eyes, and I'd seen hundreds of patients by that time. But I've never seen anything that looked quite like him.
Of the 2 million people with leprosy in India, almost 40% had eye problems, and many of them were going blind.
But the people treating them were just giving out medicines to take care of the leprosy. Very few people even looked at the eyes. They just assumed that those eyes would go blind. It was inevitable.
Persons with leprosy in the eyes do not have pain cells to help them blink. As a result, their eyes stay open day and night. And because they cannot feel pain, they often scratch the surface of the eye, leading to ulcers.
In spite of that horrible-looking ulcer, he's got no pain in the eye. Again, the disease has taken his precious sensation.
There are patients who have had corneal ulcers who, if she hadn't treated, would have gone stone blind, totally blind in both the eyes. The reason they have the vision is that she tried a kind of surgery which she perfected, tasaraphy, which closed their eyes. Actually, it made them blind for a season, and then when she opened it, they could see and the ulcer was healed.
And before we knew it, people would say, who didn't have leprosy, can't we come too? And they'd say, well, if you don't mind coming in with leprosy patients, and they say, no, we'll come. We just want you to take care of us.
Some of Margaret's former patients walked many miles just to see her when they hear she's back in Keragri.
But how are your eyes?
Nice.
Good.
Left temporalis eyes.
Which side did you do the temporalis?
Right.
Oh yes, it's doing well. Your eyes look great. How do you see? Good. You can still see
yes,
well.
He can walk. He
He'd
can
have been
do
blind without this. And he was one on whom I did the temporalis muscle transfer, using the jaw muscle to enable him to close his eyes. And that was nearly 60 years ago, and his cornea is still good. And that was a great joy to me to see shiny eyes.
The day she landed, you'll have about 20 of these old patients coming in to see her, the patients whom she had worked on, she had operated on.
Sometimes God is just saying, love this person for me. Reach out to this person. And here have I been thinking, well, what can I do for them? And really what the Lord is just saying, love them for me.
Margaret became the world's foremost authority on ocular leprosy and wrote the only textbook on the subject.
People say that she was under the shadow of Dr. Brand. I don't think so. I think she stood side by side rather than being under his shadow.
As the Brand family expanded and the work of Paul and Margaret increased, major help arrived in the form of Aroldos and his wife Menominee. Aroldos took over as cook, and Menominee cleaned and helped with the children. For 45 years, they would become as much a part of their family as their own children.
I took that photo.
Yeah.
For I want to making a enlarge.
Without their help, Paul and Margaret couldn't have accomplished all they did in India.
And this place that started as this awful place in the middle of a wilderness became the world's best training center for leprosy. And I've been there where there are people from 30, 40 countries who fly and make their way to this little tiny town in India because that's where the best treatment, the best knowledge of the disease leprosy comes from.
Paul and Margaret's contribution went far beyond medical practice and scientific discovery. They were people sent by God to open the spiritual eyes of the blind and make clean the heart of the unloved.
I think they're different in that they met people's medical needs, and through that, they were able to demonstrate the love of Christ.
One reaction, if she gets sudden pain or
I
swelling.
think that's one thing both of them have tried, showing us to treat patients with leprosy as people whom we need to respect, and there is no discrimination whether he's a beggar or a rich man. They just didn't have that. Whoever it was all of them were same to them.
I learned from them both the need for compassion, which is different from sympathy, and ends with something that is constructive and effective in remedying the social problems associated with deformity.
That style of medicine that both Paul and Margaret showed was really an incarnational style of going down to the least of these and restoring their own image, their own belief that they are valued, that they are loved by God.
One of the very first patients the Brands worked with was a young man named Sudan. He had to walk many miles to the clinic after getting thrown off a bus.
And when he finally got to the leprosarium, he was limping. His stump was bandaged. Every step he took left a red spot of blood in the dust. And he was in despair. And the Brands took him in, and he said it was the first time that anyone had touched me in maybe 6 months. In fact, when they first touched him, just held him by the shoulders, he started crying because he hadn't felt human touch in 6 months.
I think it must be about 40 years since I first saw you in Never Given a Limb.
I remember very well. I had no hopes. I came downhearted. And I told you, I'm having this ulcer for more than 20 years. It is not going to heal. Please don't waste your time. Try to do some amputation.
Margaret did surgeries to keep him from going blind, and Paul remade his hands and did what he could with his feet, made special shoes that kept him from losing any more tissue on his feet. And I remember behind him there was a picture of Paul and Margaret Brand. And underneath it, it said this, it said, "May the Spirit of the God who lives in them live also in me."
And that was years ago. And you never know the seed you sow today, maybe 40 or 50 years before anybody's going to see a harvest. But here was a whole family that had come out of the gutter, that had come out of the dark into the light.
The CMC's Rehabilitation Institute's Spinal Injury Clinic is expanding. One of their new buildings is named after Paul and Margaret Brand and will provide new beds and medical facilities for the severely injured. Dr.伉儷is director.
The rooms will be separate, but the families will share a bathroom and a kitchen.
Yes, yes.
So we can actually charge them less, but they'll get the same care.
Yes.
And in the general ward, each general ward will have 5 beds.
They knew who was in charge, and they knew why they were doing what they were doing. And that meant that any risks they took, any hardships they faced in terms of physical conditions or lack of material possessions, that was all just trivial by comparison with the excitement and the joy of what they were doing together.
And from the power of God, I think Paul and her together are examples of the very best that humankind can strive toward. And at these times we need those stories. We need those kinds of inspirations to lift us up out of the dark hours.
The Brands' legacy lives on in the lives of those they helped save and the medical personnel they diligently trained. Now a new health center begins its legacy as Margaret lays the foundation stone in memory of their work.
In a sense, that wall is not to keep people out, but is to keep out harm and give those inside the comfort and the strength that they're going to need. And it's going to be a welcome to all, a wonderful way of breaking down centuries of stigma in this disease.